Okay, so it's 2 minutes past 2:30. I have the pleasure to open the last section of our conference. This is the second English language plenary. We have wonderful guests from Hungary, from the ELTE Eötvös Loránd University. We will have presentations from the Comenius University in Bratislava and from our two organizing institutes. I will be chairing the session this time, and for my speech, Barbara Lášticová will take my time so I don't misuse my position as chair of this session. And I would like to pass the floor to Sara Csaba, Boglárka Nyúl, Márton Engyel, Kende from the Institute of Psychology at the ELTE Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. And the title of their presentation is Obedience and Dissent During the COVID-19 Pandemic, a longitudinal study from Hungary. So the floor is yours, Sara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miloslav. Yes, so just quickly sharing my screen, and please, once I reach 10 minutes or 12 minutes, please give me a vocal sign, because if I present, I won't be able to see the chat, although I can see your
yes, the first warning after 10 minutes.
Thank you. I couldn't follow, of course, the Slovakian part of the conference. However, I was here on the first plenary session, the English language session, and I was very happy to see that there was a very similar research to ours that was aligning our study or our results. So I'm happy to say that I'm going to extend somehow this previous results. So we are from the Eötvös Loránd University of Budapest, and our research is titled Obedience and Dissent During the COVID-19 Pandemic, a longitudinal study from Hungary, which is a very telling name. This is our research team. Kende is joined the session. And it's also us three junior researchers from the Department of Social Psychology. So just to give a little bit of context to our study, I would like to talk a few words about how the first wave in Hungary looked like compared to other European countries, which is somewhat important to emphasize that now we have a very, very different situation in Hungary. So in the first wave, so the first wave of the pandemic was very different. Hungary was very fast and effective in the prevention of the spread of the virus. And so basically we were successfully fighting this first wave compared to other countries in Europe, and it has to be said that this has changed by now. So we are now, I think, almost leading in deaths per million, and also we have high numbers of cases registered every day, or very low numbers of tests completed. But just to give this this short background, that the first wave was kind of a hopeful or a trustful place for Hungarians to decide why it's important, or whether it's effective to cooperate with the government. And so coming from this context and understanding the novelty of the virus, we thought that it was really important to understand why and how people would and would not cooperate with authorities. And this was not just us coming up with this idea. Of course, social scientists all over the world started to talk about the importance of trust in authorities, and of course the importance of cooperation. And talking about the Hungarian case, which is a very specific, I mean, every country is a specific case of political discourse and understanding. But talking about Hungary, we have great divisions ideologically between parties of the opposition and supporters of the opposition, and the government and the supporters of the government. And as you probably know, we have a very strong, I mean, a 2/3 majority in parliament of the current governing party, Fidesz. And the question was for us whether people who do not agree or who are on the opposite side of the government, would they be able to still accept and listen to the recommendations from the authorities? Would they be willing to obey recommendations or restrictions, especially if they do not agree with them? And it's important to say, I mentioned at the beginning that this was a longitudinal study, and things have changed a lot over time. So we need to take into consideration when we think about this study or see the results. We have to think about the effects of the events that happen between different points of data collection. So the theoretical background that we have chosen was twofold. So we basically inspired from the classical understanding of obedience, how people obey legitimate authorities, coming from, you know, the individuation studies, the classical Festinger or Zimbardo studies, and of course it cannot be left out, the authoritarian personality aspect of obedience. So how people high on RWA would be prone to obey orders even if they don't really understand, don't really agree with said orders. And on the other hand, we also know from the social psychological literature, the alternative explanation to followership, which is kind of a motivated followership. This is coming from Riker and Drury. You know, the identification with goals matters more than anything in a situation where we have to obey orders from authorities. How we can identify with either the authority giving the order or the aims, the goals of taking these orders. And we could also somehow see a collective action aspect of this whole obedience issue. So if I obey to this order, what I do, it's not just me obeying this order, but me helping others prevent a pandemic. And this has led us to this sense of efficacy. So whether if I think that my actions have an overall impact on the group's efficacy to fight this pandemic, would that alternate or modify my behavior somehow? So these are the main variables that we have used in our survey studies. So from one hand, we had authoritarianism, the classical RWA scale with 6 items, which I will show you later. We also measured agreement with authorities, right-wing political orientation, and national identity. And we assume that these ideological attitudes would be more inclined to this blind obedience part of why I obey orders. And on the other hand, we would have some variables that would also not complement, but they would add to the possibility or the probability of obedience. And these were empathy, perceived efficacy, as I mentioned before. We measured perceived norms, moral convictions, and human identity as opposed to national identity. So for this specific presentation, I will present you the only variables that I used for these hypotheses. The first one is, of course, the dependent variable, which would be obedience. And this was measured by 3 items. The first one is a reversed item saying, I would follow the recommendations of the authorities only if I think they make sense. So this is something that most people would say is defendable. However, considering, the current pandemic, if someone doesn't agree with wearing masks, is it okay if that person doesn't wear a mask or not? So of course, it's kind of a tricky question here. The 2 other questions directly measured obedience. So the second one was, I am willing to follow the recommendations of authorities, even if I don't agree with them. And the third one is, I would follow the recommendations of authorities no matter what. So these items were clearly asking about the willingness to obey, even if I don't agree with anything they say.
5 more minutes. 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much. For the independent variables, we had efficacy with 2 items. If I personally comply, it can help the community. And the second is, I think together we are able to fight the COVID pandemic. And as I mentioned, we have measured RWA with 6 items. And so just briefly about the sample, I'm happy to share the details with anyone interested on the specificities. We didn't have a representative sample, so that's very important. It's an urban, highly educated sample. That was because social media outlets followed by this type of our survey, but have managed to collect 6,000 responses for the first wave of the data. So that was a great achievement, I think. And so just some descriptive statistics about for political orientation, noticed that political orientation was highly affecting answers on every dimension in the survey. So people close to people who would lean towards the right, which is the government's political orientation, would be willing to say yes to more questions, of course. But so we wanted to control for this political orientation factor, and yet we have found that apart from RWA, which is classically linked to obedience, efficacy also had a significant effect on obedience. That meaning that people who thought that it was benefiting the community and that it was a community interest to obey the authorities, even if they don't agree with restrictions or recommendations, it has added. So it made it more likely that that these people would obey. And the second hypothesis was that it would be a long-term effect and a causal relationship between efficacy and cooperation. And for that, we have ran a random intercept cross-lax panel model, which you can see here. It's a very complicated, it looks very complicated, but it is not. It only says that efficacy, so controlling for RWA, which is something that's theoretically leads to obedience. You can see that efficacy significantly contributes to cooperation in every time point throughout the survey rollout. So all 4 points, yeah, all four points of, thank you, of data collection, people said they would cooperate, and efficacy was a significant factor that contributed to this willingness to obey authorities. So I assume you've seen the title, which said dissent. Unfortunately, I didn't have time, but I have to say that dissent was very similar to this trend, except for efficacy that did not play that big of a role in listening to dissenting voices. And the conclusion is that cooperation and obedience can be achieved in more than one ways, and this motivated followership aspect is something that we have to take into consideration when we come up with policy recommendations on how to communicate government restrictions related to COVID. So thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer questions at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara, for keeping the timeline. And you, as you rightly reminded, we will take questions also during these presentations. You can write the question in the chat, or we can have or you can ask personally in the last section, or after the presentations, where we'll have a discussion, which will be common for all the presentations. I would now ask Barbara to take my 15 minutes. I will start my presentation. I will try to share my screen now.
Okay, so I will write you into chat 5 minutes.
Yes. So do you see my screen? Is everything working?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So you've probably seen the title of my presentation. It's From Compliance to Ignorance, and also in a way it tells what my conclusions will be. And it will be about the far right in the first year of the pandemic, about the far right attitudes towards the pandemic in Slovakia in the last 12 months. I will start very similarly to Sara by explaining that Slovakia experienced a very mild first wave, even a milder first wave than was the case in Hungary. We had extremely low case numbers in spring 2020, then we had a relatively normal summer. And this was connected most likely to the creation of the official authorities to the coronavirus pandemic, bundled with a strict policy of a state quarantine for everyone who was returning to Slovakia, had to stay for 15 days in a state quarantine until he is tested and eventually released, not being COVID-19 positive. Slovakia also had one of the, or probably the most earliest face mask adaptation in the region. And in the public discourse, there were very few herd immunity proponents. And that's a lasting feature also for the discourse until now. So very little people saying that just let the infection go its course and the nature will handle things. This was not present in the discourse in Slovakia. However, the situation has changed dramatically at the end of 2020 and at the beginning of 2021. Slovakia capita, which was the case in February, we've now been surpassed by Hungary, I think. And since the beginning of the year, we have had 3 months of a relatively strict lockdown in early 2021. Currently, we are experiencing a gradual opening of the society. This is an overview of the 8 rounds of the survey, which has been repeatedly mentioned. How are you, Slovakia, for social communication, and communication agency CSAME and marketing agency MN4. They have collected the data on their online panel, was a data representative sample of the online population of Slovakia, and we have had 8 waves of this survey over the last year. So just what I wanted to show here is, you see when the data collection was happening and what was the hospitalization rate of at that time in Slovakia. So you see we had 3 rounds of the survey in spring, where we experienced the very mild first wave of the COVID pandemic, and then we had rounds in September, October, December, and then 2 rounds in this relatively strict lockdown at the end of January, beginning of February, and end of March. So my research questions will be basically 3. The first one is if there is a difference between the far right and the rest of the public in how they perceive the threat of COVID-19, and if there is a difference in how the far right and the rest of the society complies with anti-pandemic measures. The second question is if the approach of the far right in Slovakia to COVID-19 has changed in the first year of the coronavirus pandemic, and if so, in which direction? And the third question, which I would like to address, is how does the divide between the far right and the rest of the society compare to other possible dividing lines in the Slovak society? So what do we know about the is also my observation. Obviously, the far right or the populist right was very visible globally last year via the presidency of Donald Trump or the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. However, the approach of the far right over the world was more diverse than these 2 popular figures would seem to tell. It seems that the basic story was, which is highlighted in bold here, that the far-right parties in the beginning of the pandemic were quite quick to point out the dangers of the virus and were not taking the pandemic very lightly. But then gradually they changed their views, they changed their policies towards kind of propagating that COVID-19 is a harmless infection, and eventually disobeying the anti-pandemic measures. So what was the far right doing with the discourse on the pandemic? It was obviously building on the previous discourses, and it was using the previous discourses which are connected with the far right. These included blaming the ethnic minorities, those who were the ones who brought the virus to Europe, blaming immigration, propagating closing borders, which was also very in line with the policies or with what was the far right proposing. And generally, the far right has positioned itself in the role of the protectors of the freedom, either of the protectors of the freedom of speech or as the protectors of freedoms of gatherings. My hypothesis in this regard, I will show the low risk perception and the general downplaying of risk corresponds well with the masculinity cultures and the mostly masculine voter base, which is very much the case of the far right and particularly of the far right party LSNS in Slovakia. However, early analysis by Wondries and Mood in 2020 in their recent papers, they have shown that there was very little difference in the stringency indexes in countries which were either ruled or co-ruled by the far right and the rest. But they obviously analyzed only like the first part of the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic. The approach of the far right obviously was dependent on whether the far right party was part of the government or was forming the government or was in opposition. If this far right party was in opposition, then usually the path was that after initial support for the pandemic measures, the party which were in opposition usually followed a gradual transition towards fierce criticism of the anti-pandemic measures. This was very much the case also of the SNS, which is, according to von Dreesen-Muth, and probably really so, Europe's most extremist parliamentary party. It's a very far-right, even fascist party, which entered Slovak parliament for the first time in 2016 and has been re-elected also in 2020. And thanks to my colleague Josef Zagrapan, we were able to follow their early reactions to the pandemic and then the gradual kind of drift of their reactions with the official discourse. In Slovakia, we have had the first case of COVID-19 on the 6th of March. From the 16th of March, the schools have been closed, and on the next day, you see a Facebook selfie of the party leader on Facebook posing with a face cover, which later became a symbol of oppression and fight against the pandemic measures. And the party leader didn't wear or refused to wear a face cover. Then a week later in March, the party propagates the idea of establishing a company to produce face masks and protective gear to fight the pandemic, and that Slovakia is not dependent on importing the protective gear and face masks from abroad. And then gradual kind of shifts towards breaking with the official discourse emerge. There is a video on the 25th of March done by the party, which says, "You should not let enslave yourselves." And this is a video which advocates against the law which has just been passed at that time, which enabled the government to gather information on movements based on your mobile phone's position. This law was introduced, was approved by the parliament, but actually never used in practice. And then what can be seen as a clear break with the mainstream discourse on the pandemic is a video from the 15th of April, so still in the first wave, which says that coronavirus is a pretext to enslavement of people. And the listeners, the party leader, says that he is sure that the virus is artificial, but he's not sure yet if it was released accidentally, if it was a lab accident, or rather if it was done on purpose. Okay, so I'm kind of back behind my schedule. I'm just forwarding to these lovely pictures of the party leader of the listeners. So you see on the left side, this was early in the pandemic. They are taking a selfie for the Facebook page, for the fan page, covered with face mask. Later, this is a TV discussion where the party leader has been repeatedly reminded to put on his face mask, and that was what his position at that time, that wearing face masks was not good for him. So how does the rift between what the far right says about the pandemic and the official discourse on the pandemic, and we can follow it in the How Are You Slovakia survey. I do this comparison on two questions. The first is a question on general perceived threat by the coronavirus pandemic. And the second question is on contact limitations. How much do you limit your contacts with other people with regard to the pandemic? So I will show you a series of descriptive statistics. This is a comparison. I wonder how to get rid of, okay, so this is, okay, so this is the perceived threat from the pandemic between the far-right voters. These are the red ones, and the light red ones is the rest of the population. So what we can see is the first almost no difference, or even it's vice versa, that those who vote for the far right have are more afraid of the pandemic, show more perceived threat. And then later we see a drift between the rest of the society and the far right. So there's a statistical difference from, I would say, from September onwards. We have a small methodological problem with the last round, since the party has split into two parties and we have a far smaller sample of the far right voters in the last round. But generally we see the pattern that at the beginning, the threat perceived by the pandemic was the same between those who voted for far right and the rest of the society. And then we gradually see the gap widening, and the gap first emerging and then widening between what the far right voters think about the pandemic and how threatened they feel by the pandemic and the rest of the public. And this even pronounces to anti-pandemic measures follow. How do the far right voters follow the anti-pandemic measures? And we see again the same pattern. In the beginning, there was little difference or no statistical difference between how much contact limitations was there on the part of the right-wing voters. These are the two rounds of in March and April. And then we see again the gap between contact limitations among those far right supporters and those who do not support the far right. And we see particularly grave how big the difference is in this very dire situation in the first month of this year, when Slovakia had this very high numbers of deaths and a very high figures of hospitalizations due to COVID-19, and still we see that it was 1/4 of the far right voters who said they are limiting their contacts, they are limiting all of their contacts. So from compliance to ignorance, that's what I wanted to describe, what can be described also by this picture. And I promise also to compare other potential cleavages on how people perceive the pandemic. This is what's the difference between those who vote for the government parties and those who vote for the rest, for the other parties, or those who don't vote. And we see there is a general kind of trend when there was high feeling being threatened by the pandemic in the first rounds. Then you see a drop in May, and low figures in September, and then again we see a rise, but there is no statistical difference between those who voted for the current government parties and the rest of the society. Again, little difference, no difference in the behavioral part, in how much people do follow the anti-pandemic measures, if they are government party voters or no. And
last minute, Milo, left.
Okay. And even over time, we see that the gap is shrinking in the first month. In the first round, it seems that it was larger than at the end. Also, and other alternative splitting lines, what could be a difference? This is, I've divided this sample between people who say that the coronavirus has been is of natural origin, and the rest of the society, which is, we have a majority, as was mentioned in the previous section, of people who say that the coronavirus is not a natural phenomenon, and still we don't see a difference here. And this is an interesting comparison, perhaps the last one I will show now, the difference between those who say, I won't vaccinate against coronavirus, and between the rest of the society. Again, not again, but this is a new pattern. Those who do not want to vaccinate are generally less afraid of coronavirus, and it doesn't change over time. So that's the difference between the pattern which we see with the far-right voters. And I have now a few slides with multivariate analysis, which I won't comment on because I'm out of time now. But basically the conclusion is that this difference holds even if we control for age, gender, education, subjective income situation, and settlement size. Particularly age and gender are important, since the far right voters in Slovakia are generally young males who have been observed to also be very kind of risk prone and not being too afraid of the coronavirus. So even if we control for gender or age, the difference between the far right voters and the rest stays there. Okay, so this is my conclusion page. Just repeating what I've already said, the initial compliance with the official and shared view on the pandemic and lockdown measure by the far right has changed and has become the most persistent cleavage in the interpretation of the pandemic in Slovakia. And this cleavage was persistent even in terms of the highest rates of COVID-19 deaths per capita in Slovakia. And this is interesting, and my conclusion is that once an alternative interpretation was established, and among those who cheer for the far right, the link between the actual casualties and actual pandemic situation became very weak. So we would need to see if like several months of such a severe situation as we had in the previous month would kind of realign the far-right followers with the rest of the public, but we won't probably have the opportunity since the situation is now getting better. And now this is my last word. Thank you for following this presentation, and I'm looking forward towards the discussion. I'm sorry for being 2 minutes over time. Now I would like to share the floor with Barbara Lášticová, Keti Bocaj, Xenia Daniela Poslon from the Institute for Research in Social Communication of the Slovak Academy of Sciences and from the Faculty of Social and Economic Sciences from the Comenius University. And Barbara and her colleagues will have a presentation which is called Stigmatizing the Roma in Political Discourse During the Pandemic, Quarantine of the Roma Settlements in Slovakia. So the floor is yours, Barbara.
Thank you. I need to find my presentation. I'm completely overwhelmed today, but this presentation was prepared in collaboration.
Don't leave the meeting, Barbara.
Sorry? I won't.
You had a meeting.
For some reason, I'm unable to share. I'm sharing now. Do you see it? Okay, good. So perfect. Keti is my master student. This is basically her master thesis. It's still work in progress, so please bear with us. And Xenia, she was involved in the quantitative part of research from Ako sa máte Slovensko, how are you Slovakia, that we try to connect to this qualitative data I'm going to present. Basically, the background of our study is the fact that several people mentioned, Zuzana Pancová in the last session, that the coronavirus pandemics brought social solidarity in the society, but also led to deepening of differences between societal in-groups and out-groups, because some of us had different resources to cope with the pandemics based on social status than others. And the pandemics has been heavily racialized as well, and we witnessed a growing number of racial attacks against Asians in the US, for example. And the political discourse, the discourse of public authorities played an important role in this process. And in Slovakia, such a strongly stigmatized group in political discourse during the first wave of pandemics were the Roma. And we will be talking about this case. You know probably that Slovakia has one of the largest Roma populations. Around a third of Roma people live in segregated settlements with limited infrastructure, poor hygiene, and many, many problems. And since the COVID-19 first case on March 6, there have been fears that the outbreak in the Roma communities could lead to a rapid spread of the disease because of these difficult conditions these people live in. And on April 1st, the government announced plans to carry out tests in hundreds of Roma communities after it emerged that the Roma men had broken a mandatory condition to self-quarantine for 14 days after returning from the UK. Because basically many people are returning from the UK, many Roma and non-Roma working there, and there was a mandatory quarantine that this person broke. A week later, the government decided to in eastern Slovakia after infections were identified there. And while people outside the Roma settlements were required to self-isolate at home for 14 days if tested positive for COVID, the government justified the complete lockdown of the settlements on specific problems in enforcing quarantine. And then 16 days after this lockdown, the first settlement was lifted from quarantine and the others were lifted. But the Roma right groups and also many commentators said that this measure, which has involved sending army medics in to carry out testing, has stoked stigma and fear among both the Roma and the non-Roma. Because really on the media you could see like images from the war, like helicopters flying and these settlements being sealed and plenty of people in uniforms, either police or military, and it was really like war imagery. Basically, at the time in the Ako sa máte Slovensko research, interested in how people perceived these measures and whether people perceived that the Roma were more threatening than others in relation to the COVID, and whether the Roma were more threatened than other groups, on the other hand. So when we asked which groups pose the biggest threat in terms of spreading the coronavirus in Slovakia, so you can see that those people were the people that do not respect quarantine measures, of course. But the Roma and the Slovak citizens that come back to Slovakia from abroad share the second place in terms of threat, because really those were the people that were most talked about in the media at the time as potential carriers of the virus. On the other hand, when we asked about the risk of being infected and about which groups are the most threatened by the coronavirus, you can see that the Roma were among the least threatened groups, or were the least threatened groups. And when we asked about the measures people agreed with, the measures that were taken during the first wave of the pandemics, so you can see that closing of the Roma settlements, of some of the Roma settlements, the quarantine, the lockdown was like most accepted among all the coronavirus related measures in the first 2 months of pandemics in Slovakia. So Roma are a threat. It's okay to lock them down, but they aren't threatened, is the conclusion from this representative data. Then we decided to analyze the accounts of public authorities used to justify or criticize the quarantine of the Roma settlements during the first wave of the pandemics, and to identify the main discourses and their discursive resources. And this is the analysis that I will present now. We focused on the period from half March to the end of May, since the first day when the state of emergency was declared to the day when most of the measures were lifted. We went into the Slovak Press Agency archives and were searching for combination of keywords such as Roma and COVID, Roma and quarantine, and focused only on discourse of like political authorities at the state level, but also on the local level, and of police representatives and Roma community plenipotentiary office, which is a special office in Slovakia. And after first like more than 300 articles, the corpus was reduced to about 60 articles because of repetitions and redundancies. Basically, the 4 types of political discourse that we identified were the following one. The first one was the medical or scientific discourse that justified the quarantine based on the difficult hygienic conditions in the Roma settlements that favored the virus spread. The second, technical discourse, focused really just on the chain of events, on the logistics of events, and constructed the lockdown in Roma settlement just as another military operations. It was really the discourse by the representatives of the army. The third, the control and surveillance discourse, justified the quarantine by the fact that the Roma are essentially responsible and we cannot trust them to obey the hygienic and the pandemic measures. And the fourth one, the weakest one, was the human rights discourse that just stressed that you cannot close down a whole village based on ethnic stereotypes. So a couple of examples for each. So the first, the medical and scientific discourse stressed that this is really not about the ethnicity, because Peter Polák, the member of European Parliament and a member of the COVID Central Response Team, who happens to be a Roma as well, he said that the Roma are no different from other people coming back from abroad where they work to Slovakia, but the only difference is that the spread in the Roma settlements is much more dangerous because of difficult conditions these people live in, and the spread could be much faster, so we really need to quarantine them. And basically it's very difficult to respect the hygienic measures in these places, not even to speak of home quarantine. And similarly, the Minister of healthcare, the then Minister of Healthcare, he's not in office anymore, said explicitly, because he reacted to the accusation of certain people that it is really stigmatizing Roma, that this is not based on any ethnicity, it is based on that if the infection in an area is out of control, we need to close these areas to prevent them to gradually infect the whole country. We later witnessed in autumn that this wasn't the case, that the whole areas other than the Roma weren't closed, because when the north of Slovakia was heavily infected, they absolutely refused local lockdowns, but those were non-Roma localities. The logistical or technical discourse constructs the lockdown just as another military crisis intervention, because this is standard procedure in international crisis management operation, and the whole activity of the Slovak armed forces is for the sake of the Roma health and safety, and this is just a normal thing of dealing with virus outbreak in vulnerable communities. Coronavirus discourse looks differently, because, as I mentioned already, the Roma are constructed in discourse as responsible. And this is typically voiced by the mouth of the former Prime Minister Igor Matović, but not only by him, also by certain local municipality representative, by mayors of the towns where the Roma settlements are or where the Roma segregated neighborhoods are. The Prime Minister Matović, at the very end of March, he said about the Roma, when those people will crawl around infected, we will pay for it. And later on, a month later, he said, even today, most of the Roma do not respect the quarantine. In the meantime, they have infected plenty other people, and we have no chance to identify whom. And of course, we didn't have the chance to identify how many people they infected, but that's another story. But on the other hand, Igor Matović, he draws also on scientific being discriminatory in his measures, but he really switches between these two positions. And in between these two citations, he said this: in no case this was supposed to be an attack to stigmatize the Roma or to consider them as people who dragged the infection here. This is not the fault of those Roma that they were not stopped at the border and placed into state quarantine. And here he's accusing indirectly the previous government of Peter Pellegrini that was still in office at the beginning of the pandemics of not being strict enough in enforcing the state quarantine. The local mayors are also very present in this control and surveillance discourse. And even though no positive cases were reported in many of these local areas, they still construct the Roma as a threat. So this is by the mayor of Rimavská Sobota, where a segregated Roma neighborhood, Dužavská cesta, is. And he said, despite the fact that until this moment, we do not have any positively tested persons in the town, we are worried about the mass new coronavirus outbreak. And he added that of these Roma people, they do not get tested, and then they will go shopping into the town and they will infect us all. And there is another reason for this control and surveillance. Constructing the Roma as a threat, but not because they are inherently responsible, but because they're one of the vulnerable groups of society in the societies. And this is the case from the city of Prešov, where the municipal police gave the masks to the local community center, social workers who are in charge of educating the local Roma community inhabitants about how they should obey the hygienic measures. But then again, they distribute those masks only against a signature, because the Roma later could be questioning this help. So there is some kind of, again, a mistrust in the Roma and their ability to understand the situation and to behave responsibly and honestly in this situation. Finally, a very minority discourse just mentioned by the vice chairman of the Slovak parliament, by the Slovak president Zuzana Čaputová, was based on ethnicity. And this is a quotation by Juraj Šeliga at the occasion of the Roma International Day on April 8 last year, who says that we really cannot accept this extremist and conspirators discourse who try to take advantage of the situation in order to provoke passions and hostility against the Roma. And let's focus on concrete individuals, not on social group. Do not essentialize the whole social groups. And let's focus on concrete individuals who behave irresponsibly, but we cannot ever, not even during this crisis, admit collective guilt. And then he says, and he speaks of repercussions of collective guilt in the history. So to sum up, the control and the surveillance discourse was predominant in our data, and it was mainly represented by the prime minister and the local mayors. The pandemics, even in Slovakia, was racialized based on ethnic stereotypes, but then many local mayors after the pandemics acknowledged that, but everything went smoothly and the Roma cooperated peacefully in spite of the expectations. The Roma were dehumanized and objectified as so many times before and reduced to the level of settlements, to the level of segregated communities, to the level of object, not individual people. Again, as in other studies we carried out recently, the Roma are portrayed as a collective character with no voice or agency. The locally bound events concerning just several settlements in Eastern Slovakia are again presented as national, so the threat is even bigger by this strategy. We identified what we called conditional solidarity. This is Keti, my student, who invented this term, and I like it very much, because many mayors said that they provided the Roma the access to water and electricity, the free access to water and electricity during the pandemic, but it was really done to protect the non-Roma in-group from spreading the virus outside of the communities. And the Roma in our data were constructed both as vulnerable and as a threat. And if you want to find out more about the political research and political discourse on the Roma, you can visit the website of our project Polrom that is just ending, and you will find more data from different countries about how politicians and public authorities speak of the Roma. Thank you for your attention. And thanks Keti and Xenia for helping out with the data collection and analysis.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for sticking with the timeline better than I was at this discipline. And now I'm asking if we have Marek Urban, the fourth presentation. Okay, it's nice to have you here. So you can start and please share your screen.
Yes. Am I sharing?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So thank you for previous presentations, and we will have a slightly different presentation. We will talk about coping strategies which were adopted during COVID-19 lockdown from the second and third week
of March.
Of March, yeah.
Last year, yeah.
So just a quick introduction. Elevated the COVID-19 outbreak was connected to elevated levels of stress among the population, and it was quite worldwide. So we were able to see it in different countries and populations. And we look at the situation in Slovakia, and what was our aim was to look at the different coping strategies which were adopted during these stressful events
by different groups of participants, as we will talk about it.
Because what's different when we are in when we are in stress, we employ different coping strategies, but those coping strategies are used for daily stressful events or situations. And this particular situation of COVID-19 outbreak was different because it was unpredictable, and we were not used to it, and so the adaptation was different. And as we can see, when we adapt coping strategies, we can adapt coping strategies which are emotional focused, problem focused, or appraisal focused. And so, which coping strategy we our own personality and also on the situation or event. And different coping strategies have different results on our well-being. And what was special in this situation was that we couldn't not focus on problem solving strategies, because we were not able to solve the situation. We were not able to stop the spreading. We were able by wearing masks or isolating from the others, but still COVID-19 virus was here with us. So we needed to adapt different coping strategies.
This is the reason why everyone was recommending to use, to create the routines, daily habits, and everything, because that is the problem-solving strategy. You should be able to somehow control your environment. However, in the COVID-19 strategies, it was worldwidely somehow researched that these problem-solving strategies are less effective, and the people who are adapting them in the everyday situations were not so effective in their adaptation during the COVID-19 crisis.
Was that active emotion-focused strategies are more effective in the situation like spread of COVID-19. And you can see descriptions of different coping strategies which we employ in our research. And some of them are passive, some of them are active, some of them are more emotional focused, and some of them are more problem solving focused. And what we looked at, we wanted to examine the effect of those coping strategies on perceived levels of stress. And we also look at the grid. When we imagine grid, we can also talk about
persistent effort in following one's dreams and goals
in long-term perspective. And what we hypothesized is that the adaptation of coping strategies will mediate the relationships between grid and perceived stress, because previous research has found that grid is connected to perceived levels of stress or lower the level of stress. And our second hypothesis was that different people will adapt different combinations of strategies, and those different combinations of strategies will lead to different levels of perceived stress. So as I have told you at the beginning of our presentation, is that we collected data between second and third week of the COVID-19 lockdown in Slovakia, and our sample was considered of students, professionals like healthcare professionals, scientists, and other professionals. But what we didn't analyze the difference. We analyzed the differences between those groups, but today I will not talk about the differences. So our measurements, we used standardized versions of questionnaires. We used perceived stress scale, which has two scales, self-efficacy scale and perceived helplessness. And we used the Czech version of coping style questionnaire. You were able to see it in the previous slides, and also the grid scale. All participants were instructed to indicate on a 5-point Likert scale how they felt since the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, and how likely they were to have reacted in the particular way when they were irritated or disturbed or upset since the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak. It is important because when you look at the stress level, you always give participants limited time, like in the last week or in the last month, how often have you felt this way? So we wanted to capture the beginning of the COVID-19. So what have we found?
So the direct effect of greed on coping strategies was significant, and the direct effect of coping strategies on perceived effect of perceived stress was significant. And the direct effect of greed on perceived stress was not significant, which means that the greed was mediated by coping strategies on the perceived stress. So this means that the people who had different levels of greed adopted different coping strategies, leading to different levels of stress. This is important finding because generally the greed is examined in the college students and high school students and all these different samples and
managers.
Yes, and it is generally connected with lower levels of DAS, like depression, anxiety, and stress scales. But it was never examined how actually the people with higher greed do that they have different levels of these measurements. So it is like that probably that people with different levels of greed adopt different coping strategies, as we will show also later here. This was the first analysis. The second analysis was the cluster analysis, which identified 4 separate clusters of participants. The first one was were the greedy persons. I can. The greedy persons which are high in greed and high use of positive coping strategies and low use of negative coping strategies. Then there were easygoers, which was average greed and average use of positive coping strategies, but low of use of negative coping strategies. Then were avoiders, which was average greed, active use of both positive and negative coping strategies, and powerless, low greed and low use of positive coping strategies and high use of negative coping strategies. This picture is important. The first 2 scales are the helplessness, perceived helplessness and perceived self-efficacy.
Scale of stress.
Yes. Then there are 2 greed scales, consistency of interest and perseverance of effort. And then there are the positive coping strategies and negative coping strategies. The most important finding here is that it was even more important to have low levels of negative coping strategies. Okay, we can go on. Which is really important because in the negative coping strategies are like rumination, self-accusation, and all these things were really connected with the really very high levels of stress. So what is the important for each of groups of these participants? For the greedy persons were actually acting really fine. Long-term goals plays a protective role in minimizing the immediate effects of the stressor. This is a hypothesis which was hypothesized in the research before us. It seems that the greedy person, it seems really that the greed has the protective plays a protective role since the long-term goals and the focusing on the long-term perspective is really playing a protective perspective on the perceived stress. Easygoers, which was the most frequent actually the part of the cluster of participants, they were using a lot of positive strategies, which more positive strategies than negative strategies, and was minimizing the intensity of stress, promoting positive self-esteem by being aware of past achievements. And then there were 2 clusters which were
high in stress,
and these were avoiders and powerless. Avoiders tendency to escape and persistent thinking about the stressor. So here we can see that we are getting more negative coping strategies, and this is linked with the high levels of stress. But the most important cluster was the people feeling powerless. And this is really something striking if you imagine that we made this research like from the 2 to 3rd week of the lockdown, because we can define powerless people or people feeling powerless as really group who was experiencing the exhaustion or allostatic overload. And this was like really only the second to third week of the lockdown. So we can imagine how these people are feeling a year later, you know. So these people were really defined by the highest use of self-accusation and resignation and lack of control, with really like a very strong feeling of helplessness and lowest level of perceived self-efficacy.
So we wanted to finish in a positive way. So we prepared like several steps which could be implied in our public discourse, and which can lead to lower levels of perceived stress. Our policymakers should communicate clearly their steps and how those steps will lead to concrete goals. We talk a lot about the importance of scientific data and scientific rationales behind those it's nice to say those decisions. Yeah, it's nice. And also we need to make a predictable environment for those people who are feeling that they are trapped in the situation and it will never end. So we need to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And for media, it's the same. They need to put some solutions. How can we, how different states or countries are dealing with the crisis? What can we learn from those examples? And we know that the rumination was really strong predictor of high level of stress. So it's important to avoid sharing information which lead people to ruminate about the stress or about the situation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marek Urban and Kamila Urban. I apologize for not introducing your institutes. Marek Urban represents the Evangelista Purkyně University, and Kamila Urban represents the Institute for Research in Social Communication of the Slovak Academy of Sciences. We have arrived at our discussion, so please raise your hands or write your question in the chat. If you want to ask something. I see Franz is raising his hand, and I see Barbara had she has her hand up. So I would like to ask Barbara first.
I have two questions, so maybe Franz could go first. Franz, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, so
I have a question both to Sara and Milo concerning the connection between right-wing parties and their answer to COVID. I think Sara pointed out this expected relationship that authoritarianism, well, we should expect the right-wing parties, since they are expected to be authoritarian, in favor of law and order, etc., or what we know, we should expect generally that they would be in favor of law and order politics, which means following strict rules, etc., which seems to be the case in a few Eastern European countries where right-wing parties are in power, which is not the case, exactly the opposite in the United States and in Brazil, where right-wing leaders are in power, but also in many other countries, as the case of which Milo told us about, this minority party, also in many other European countries, Germany, Austria. I do not know exactly about Hungary. There are also right-wing parties. I mean, they would down. Well, this is not so clear for me whether they all downplay the danger or deny the danger of the virus, which you, Milo, you pointed to this aspect of masculinity culture among the right-wing parties. So if they would downplay everywhere, then we should expect that everywhere they should act like they act in the United States or in Brazil or in Germany, the AfD or your right-wing party. If they are authoritarian, we would expect that they would act everywhere like they act in Hungary or maybe in Poland. So this is, for me, it's a riddle. It makes sense. This masculinity culture argument makes sense. The authoritarianism argument makes sense, but then I see a contradiction. Well, we can see that in some countries, I think your argument was, Milo, that where they are in the opposition, or also in this article which you mentioned by Bondes and Matt, or that they say it depends whether they are in the opposition or whether they are in power. But evidently, it's not only this question of power or opposition. We have a few cases in Eastern Europe where they are in power. We have these two important cases, United States and Brazil, where they're also in power, but where they have the opposition strategy to well, opposition from our point of view. So it's, for me, it's somehow a riddle, this attitudes of the right-wing parties. In Austria, it's astonishing that the Freedom Party, which always was authoritarian, now they are the big defenders of freedom of speech, freedom of movement, against police measures. So for me, it's kind of a riddle, which I cannot solve in my head. Maybe you could, you or maybe also others could comment on this issue.
Okay, Sara, could you please answer first?
Well, I will try to. I'm not saying that I can solve this riddle. What is important, I think, from where we come from, where our research comes from, is that I wouldn't say that our sample represents the government supporting people very well in this research. So I would say that where our research can clarify some things is rather the political left, or the opposition of the Fidesz-KDNP government in Hungary. But I also think that in terms of which right-wing party or which right-wing government handles the situation in this way or that way, I would agree with you that it's more than just power relations, but it has to do with power relations a lot. And you cannot really discount the importance of whether a party is as strong as Fidesz was in Hungary at the beginning of the COVID, because they could have, sorry to say this, but they could have done everything, and most of the people would have gone with them. And so I think it was a choice at the beginning. And then, so at the beginning, the Hungarian government took the virus very seriously. So we closed down everything. At the moment, we have had a few cases. But at the end of the day, by the second wave, when the prevention wasn't successful, they started to downplay the obvious pitfalls of their own prevention measures. So I told you I wouldn't solve this riddle. I just thought that I could maybe add to this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sara. I will try to provide my answer. I think in this case, which you highlight, France, I think there's a clear contradiction in like being authoritarian and at the same time organizing protests when there is a curfew outside and rioting with the police and so on, like creating right the opposite of like an ordered society. And I think in the Slovak case, as you've seen, the party has struggled to find its position with where it stands. At the beginning, they were not downplaying the measures and the pandemic. They were taken pretty seriously, but in a few days or weeks, they somehow realized that their position is primarily as the anti-system party, and if the system goes for the pandemic measures, they in principle cannot like support the system and support the measures. So they were positioning themselves in the opposition against what the system was telling. So I think basically it tells about the far right, at least about this Slovak very far right party, SNS, that they are more an anti-system party than a party like which has a coherent ideology, which has a coherent far right ideology. It's rather an anti-system party which is connected. It's more an anti-system party than a coherent and far right party, like sticking to the discourse of like being authoritarian and so on. And I think an important like facet of this situation is also that these parties, particularly Bolsonaro and also Donald Trump, tend to be also populist, and like sticking to strict lockdown measures is not a popular measure. So sooner or later, this type of political parties tends to switch to the other side, to the side of the proponents of the herd immunity, or those who say this was just a flu and just a minor illness. What was interesting for me, that even if these were proven wrong, at least in the Slovak case, in the first 3 months of this year, when the situation was like severe and in a comparatively seen one of the worst situations with regard to dying on COVID worldwide, this still didn't change the position of those party supporters. So once you have established the opposition, it's very, very hard to change it, even if the situation and if the facts around change. So that would be my few thoughts on the issue. Have we satisfied your curiosity, Franz, or rather not?
Thank you. It was good responses from both sides. But I think one could go on discussing, but I want to leave the floor to others to put their questions.
Okay, so Barbara was asking next.
Yes, I have one question for Kamila and Marek, and one question for Shari. Kamila, so I was quite surprised by those passive, pessimistic people Marek mentioned, and it's really quite crazy to see that it was really 2 weeks into the pandemics. And do we have any information on the strategies these people generally use, like their pre-pandemic strategies, because this might explain a lot in this tendency?
Yeah. Usually those people try those active emotional focus strategies. It's like I go out with my friend and trying to talk about it, about the situation, or I am crying, or those really emotional focused. And right now, those people are feeling alone and helpless, and they can move and they don't know what to do with their life. And I can see that some of those people are totally passive, and they are like, oh, I don't care about anything, do what you want, and don't reply emails, and are really stuck in the situation. So it's even worse right now.
So we really talk about the exhaustion.
Yeah.
Right now. It's as we indicated it last year, like after the third week of the lockdown, we can see now that it really is only deepening the state, and the people are really just getting exhausted. And as it is described in the stress literature, this allostatic overload is really causing a lot of harm, especially to these people.
Because they cannot use their previous strategies effectively,
yes,
right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Shari, if I may ask, so you did 3 waves, right?
4 waves.
4 waves already. And so what are the differences between those 4 waves? Because you mentioned that the situation has changed quite differ strikingly. So what are the main differences that you observed? The series, right? In the yeah.
Yes, actually the one thing that we have seen is that from because in the beginning, so we had this successful prevention or intervention of the pandemic. And I think people believed that the pandemic was over and we were successful in fighting off the pandemic. And so they've become relaxed and they've become, you know, easygoing on whether we should take it as seriously as we did in the beginning. But also in the meantime, we had some decisions in Hungary that were rather controversial. You know, one of the first laws that were passed after dangerous situation was announced was to stop transgender people being able to change their birth, you know what I mean.
Birth certificate.
The birth certificate. Thank you, Barbara. So it looked like it was a situation that they started to use against so they started to abuse it. People perceived political decisions after these. So this was when we look at this data, I think we have to consider also that in the meantime, there's been a lot of changed the perception of the prevention measures of the government. And I also want to ask Anna to join this conversation, because I guess that you also have some insights on this.
What changes? Sorry.
So how the government's decisions and the discourse changed the perception of
mass data collection, which was at the beginning of the second wave and which suddenly seemed more severe than the previous one. There was an increase in obedience, but very clearly there was a dip during the summer months. And I think by now, I think we should have collected more data, because now the opinions are much more polarized than they were. But so I don't know. On the one hand, I think there is a very the opposition and government agrees on a lot of the measures, and in terms of vaccination policy. But at the same time, the issues, so there is a lot, the tension has been growing because of the increased threat. And also your topic, Barbara, so it's only been in the recent months that people started recognizing the incredible effect on Roma people in Hungary and so on. So there is a lot of issues, but I don't want to take the floor from the speakers.
Thank you, Anna.
Okay, thank you. Are you happy with the answers, Barbara?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
And I see Xenia has raised her hand. So, Xenia.
Yeah, I don't have a question for a specific presenter. It's more kind of what occurred to me during all of these talks in this session is that, well, it would be really nice to have data on the combined Kamila and Marek's research and our How Are You Slovakia's Because it would be really interesting to see what are the coping strategies used by right-wing voters. Is it complete avoidance, or is belief in conspiracy theories a new type of strategy in itself? So I'm not sure if we do have something on this, or we should have.
The question about strategy is so long, so we cannot use it.
That's the problem, yeah. We should find some shorter scale.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I don't see a question in the chat, so.
Anna is raising her hand.
I see Anna has risen her hand, so.
Yeah, if there's time, I have a question.
So Anna, please, you can ask.
Thank you. So my question is to Barbara about these discourses you may have mentioned, and I just missed it. I'm sorry about that, if that's the case. But I'm just curious whether there was an identifiable pattern in the different, either connected to specific events that you mentioned or the different waves of the pandemic, because also in Slovakia, it played out very differently, the first wave and the most recent period. So I'm just, because I know it can be a combination of a lot of things. There could be an increased solidarity when there is a high threat, where we feel we are all in the same boat, but at the same time, when there is a real threat, we can also feel less solidarity for other victims and start scapegoating. So I'm just curious whether you noticed any pattern in terms of the timeline of how the pandemic played out in how Roma people were presented.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. In this analysis, we focused only on this Roma settlements lockdown, which occurred in the first wave, so during April and May, and really the mentions of the Roma peaked in political discourse in that period. And this is just an anecdotal evidence, but we almost do not speak of the Roma now. But I haven't looked, in the databases, I haven't looked in the archives, and I cannot say how much those mentions have declined. But just from anecdotal evidence, just from following the media, well, the Roma are almost not spoken about now, because those that were really in relation with this big uncertainty at the beginning of COVID, and with this big wave of people coming from abroad, and a substantial part of them were the Roma. But this is a very interesting suggestion, thank you, and we should have a look at it, about how the mentions about the Roma were framed the rest of the year and during the first year. That would be very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, last opportunity to ask a question. We are approaching the end of our session. I had a technical question to Sara, or is it Sara, or is it Sara? About the presentation, Sara Csaba. You said you are using hierarchical modeling, and I was wondering what were your levels actually, which you used. Was it like the wave was one of the round?
No, for the hierarchical regression, I used only the first wave of data collection. So that was based on the 6,000 respondents who took the first survey, and the hierarchy was, so basically the first round was the political orientation to control for it, and the next one was the RWA, and the third one was efficacy, to see whether efficacy has something to add to this model. And it's a small effect, I know, but it's still it's a significant effect, and I think this is telling us something about how people perceived the benefits of obedience.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions? Please don't hesitate, then won't be another opportunity to ask. So if we don't have any other questions, I would like to conclude our session, and also, in fact, conclude our conference. I'm very glad that we could meet, at least virtually, in these very strange times, and I hope we are heading into a very bright future very, very soon. So thank you again to everyone for participating. Thank you to the Institute of Research of Social Communication. Thank you to Barbara Lášticová. Thank you to Robo Klobucký. Thank you to Xenia Daniela and to Mariana, who were so kind and provided chairing of sessions, organizing information. There will be a book of abstracts published from the conference. We will inform you about when this is happening. And I'm asking Barbara and Xenia if there is anything I should be adding at the end of conference now.
I don't think so. I would like to thank to all of you who stayed until the end. We have some people watching on Facebook, so I want to thank everybody for participating, our distinguished guests from other countries and other universities for joining us. And I am quite happy about today because we learned so many interesting things, and it's quite fascinating how many research was done during the last year and how many research was published already. So at least this was one of good outcomes of the COVID, that it mobilized us to grasp this unusual situation and to make the most of it and to understand it. So thank you again. And once we have news about the book of abstracts or any other events related to this conference, we will keep you posted. Thank you.